those of you that don't know me, my name is Mark Lang. I am, I guess, for the alumni that are here, for perspective, I am the new George Carroll. For those of you that are still here, that has with it some history, I suppose. But one of the things that George did well, and this day could not have been, we couldn't have had this day without that effort, is that he kept things. So he kept the file cabinets filled with photos from our graphic arts department. And one of the things that's sort of fallen under my purview in the role of IT and webmaster and social media is I want to share that history. I think that history is a really, really important piece of our time here at Stony Brook. And so a major effort's been underway for most of my tenure here now, since 2011, to digitize that work. So our special reports that a lot of you may have helped write have been in file cabinets in the pub's room for years. And working with the library, we got those digitized. Getting the pictures of our old boats and all of our, just research and the people and getting that all in a place where it can be shared. It's been a ridiculously long process, but it's a true mark of our history. Doug Hardy here today has helped bring some of that history too. He recently helped deliver some of our the Captain Stewie archives, his personal collection of photos and such, and we've been working to get those digitized. So thank you, Doug, for getting that taken care of. But the other piece is because we keep a lot of things. Part of the digitization effort has been our biennial reports. So you may have seen some as you came in. We've been putting these out since I've been here for the past 2 years, or every 2 years. But we've had a couple back in the day that, during Jerry's time here, that sort of highlighted with beautiful graphics and easy and readable text our history. And our next speaker may seem out of place. Well,
I like it. It's okay.
It may seem out of place. However, it is a rich part of our history. Environmental poetry is in our history. It's been in these reports, and it's just a great way. Again, to talk about Christine communicating science, you have to speak in a different, communicate your science in a different way. And thank you for putting these together, Jerry. I really appreciate it, and it's been a pleasure to find our rich history within our archives. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. David Taylor. He is a professor in the Sustainability Studies department, now part of SoMAS. He's been at Stony Brook since 2014.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Making sure. Yeah. Okay.
He got his PhD in 1994 from the University of Tennessee. Native Texan.
Yes.
Native Texan. Native. As a Midwesterner, I can. We have a lot to talk about.
Yes.
His research and his work focuses on environmental humanities, creative writing, science writing, and a pre-1900 American literature. Did I miss anything?
No, I think it'll do it.
Fantastic.
All right.
Welcome, David.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. I was really worried when Larry asked me to consider doing this. And if you looked at the little bio in there, I tell people that I think of myself as somebody who works at poetry, as I tell my students, because I prefer that to watching television. I think if you were to ask people who make their careers writing poetry, which is a very hard thing to do, they might have some different responses. But I want to tell you a little bit about this, and then we'll kind of go from there and talk about this curious place, because I don't want to argue that it's somehow the answer, because I don't think that would be a very wise claim. But I think if you were to look at and say, oh, what's the stereotype of a poetry reading? One, I would say, that's a pretty good crowd. I really don't know about the beard thing, but I seem to have that part down. There's a couple of people talking about metaphors and meter and other things. But I think this is a very typical kind of view of what we think of as modern poetry. And I want to talk about that a little bit today to sort of get at what I think, why I would say curious, and what the role of poetry has become and where it might have a place. So let me start with just one little line and one little image we'll go into a little bit more later. But an old friend of mine, Allison Hawthorne Deming, she's the endowed professor of creative writing and science communication at the University of Arizona, has a line from her short essay my students will be reading later, where she says, sentimentality is the enemy of both science and poetry. And if you look down here, this is actually from this Sunday at the New York Botanic Gardens, where with the Chihuly exhibit, they actually have poetry that is written by kindergarten through 12th graders, and they have these placards next to the Chihuly glass exhibits in the midst of typically then, which is often connected to the kinds of plants that they have nearby. So I'll come back to these a little bit. Well, for being in the humanities, I am actually pretty OCD about structure and organization. I really like things neat and orderly, so I'll give you a little bit of an outline. What is poetry? Well, that's going to take about 20 minutes. No, it's going to take a short time. I'll do the short version of it. I want to talk a little bit, though, about this idea of environmental communication. Kate Albrecht and I taught a class last spring in climate change, the science of climate change, and environmental communication. And it was really interesting for us to begin to talk with our students about this question of communicating climate change, and then to send our students out onto Long Island and to talk with people about this from differing fields and differing kinds of economic and social backgrounds. And we learned a lot, as well as I think our students. And then a little part two, we'll talk a little bit about what poetry might be able to offer. And again, I'm not going to suggest that's more than I need to. And then some old, new, old, and diverse venues. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Raise your hand if you have a degree in the humanities. Oh, this is going to go great. All right. No, I'm teasing. It's fine. So, if we go back, and I'm to say, all right, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is basically 2100 BC, is considered the oldest poem. But if you think about it, in oral traditions of storytelling, we have to have mnemonic devices. So rhythm and rhyme are always a part of the oral tradition of telling a story, because it's a way for us to memorize things, right? How many times have you wanted to get a Barry Manilow lyric out of your head? Why? Because he was writing jingles for 10 years before he started writing pop music. And he realized really quickly that's the way our brains work. We catch on to these things. So in this oral tradition, storytelling and poetry always had with it, either it was by the balladeers of lyrics, they had with them this sort of rhythm and structure to language. Out of that grew then later a more printed version, say Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in the late 15th century. And as printing became more possible, what happened is poets began to think of poetry not as only an oral tradition, but as also a print tradition, which allowed them to play with language and diction, to begin to use different kinds of metaphor and structure, to be thinking about simile, to be thinking about allegory. This is then leads even farther to, by the time you get to some later works like Shakespeare's sonnets in the early 17th century, you realize that what he can do, as others, is they start developing forms of poetry, whether it's sonnets, villanelles, terze rime, you can go down the list, there's literally dozens of very formal structural poetry. And in this tradition, then, poetry starts moving in part away from this sort of oral tradition into a print tradition. This is where it gets interesting when we get to Leaves of Grass and Walt Whitman and the American tradition of poetry, who borrows an oral tradition of what he hears on Long Island, in Brooklyn, and he uses the language of people, but he, again, keeps it in a print version. However, he begins to break away from these traditions of form and creates new forms based upon the topic, and they tend to be then these very long poems. if you actually look at it, Leaves of Grass, the poem itself, if you think of it as one poem, is over 90 pages long. In this way, poetry then has, since the 1850s, kind of moved into different traditions, and you see this split in contemporary poetry. You get some old geezer like this, writing by himself in a very, what I'm going to call for this presentation, a traditional form, meaning I write, I work at them, I revise them, they're print, I send them to these journals, people look at them, they decide if they think they're very good, they send them back, they take it, not very often, but they do sometimes. And then eventually, after I've published maybe 20 to 25 poems, I can go to a press and I can say, would you publish my book of poetry? And that's a very kind of traditional way of doing it. But I would say to you, if you think poetry is dead, I would say to you, look at rap and hip hop, which is the dominant form of poetry and language and music right now. And all it is somebody needs a rhythm behind it. And it's just poetry. And that actually is, I think, a far more successful sort of oral tradition. But in this traditional way, I think this has been then something that has been marginalized in the way that we think of that stereotype. So in this way, poetry is kind of in this very tradition. But let's think about it as a form of environmental communication, because nature poetry and poetry about the natural world has been a long tradition. Flor claims that basically environmental communication has 6 essentials. And this is, if you think back to what Christina was just saying, it's very much like this. Knowledge of good science or ecological laws, sensitivity to cultural dimension, ability to network effectively, efficiency in using media for social agenda setting, appreciation and practice of environmental ethics, and conflict resolution, mediation, and arbitration. I think these do make sense when we're thinking of environmental communication and thinking about broad audiences and trying to communicate good science about environmental issues. But if we're to say, in this way of thinking, traditional poetry, print poetry, I'm going to do a reading, it's going to be called a poetry reading, then I think the problem with this is poetry doesn't really then do these very well. Because if you look at it, most of the people attending contemporary poetry readings, it tends to be creative writing majors. How many of you have been to a poetry reading in the last month? And probably because you have lives, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Because I think in part that's where poetry's gone wrong. Efficiency in using media for social agenda setting. And I think traditional poetry does that very poorly these days. There are people who are coming back to self-publishing, which I think is actually quite healthy in some ways, but in general they don't. And then conflict resolution, mediation, and arbitration, I don't think poets think about that at all. So, I wish Howie was here. I think that's a fake cat. I was looking around, and I was like, I don't know, it's kind of weird looking. But, is traditional poetry a good medium for environmental communication? And I think the sort of cursory answer is no. I don't think it is in a very sort of overt way in the ways that you may think of that Christina was talking about science and communication or environmental engagement and outreach. And I think the reasons are pretty clear. Declining readership. In 1992, 17% of Americans had read a work of poetry at least once in the past year. 20 years later, that's fallen by more than half. In 2002, the share of poetry readers has contracted by 45%, resulting in the steepest decline in any literary genre. And if we're ever get below opera, we're in trouble. Okay? But again, I think if you look at this and you look at the way Ingram is talking about this, he's talking about this tradition of poetry as it's generally taught within MFA programs. So in some ways, traditional poetry has increasingly narrowed its audience to specialists. It has also become less effective in engaging general readers and listeners in social, political, and in this case, environmental concerns. And I think this is increasingly a problem with what I'm calling traditional poetry, is that it's become so narrow and so disengaged from a broad audience and finding its relevance in differing groups and differing kinds of places, that's led to this kind of, now almost irrelevance. But I want to say that's the core of what we're talking about today, right? That the real problem is that effective environmental communication and change happens when we take good information from our specialties. And if we want to call it our silos, we go to our places, we do the things we're supposed to do. You know, I write things for literary scholarly publications that I know I'm supposed to do to make everyone here at Stony Brook happy. But then it's my job to do more. If I don't do more and I'm in an environmental humanities program, I'm not doing the rest of my job, which is then to find where what I've learned in those moments of specialty have application outside of it, to differing audiences, to differing groups. That's the part where, and then work collaboratively to communicate to multiple audiences in multiple venues. So, what can poetry offer? Let me go back and look at this line a little bit and then tell you a story about one of my old colleagues at my old university. So Allison says sentimentality is the enemy of both poetry and science. And what I think she's suggesting there is that poetry isn't ever, if it's worth reading, about sentimentality. It's about caring. And what we're talking about today is the notion or the definition of caring as sentimentality is the very problem. It's emotion without reason. It's reaction without thought. It's decision without knowledge. All of those same things, I would say, make a shitty poem, right? If you're not adding all of those parts and backgrounds, poetry doesn't do anything. Sentimentality isn't a love poem. That's a seduction poem. A love poem is much more in-depth, much more reflective, asks the reader to participate far more than another Hallmark card. And this is in part, I want to tell you this little story. So one of my old colleagues, he's a professor emeritus at my old institution in North Texas. He was a biologist and a limnologist, and he was telling me the story once why he went into the sciences. And he said, you know, my first passion actually when I was young was literature and poetry. He goes, but I had this 7th grade teacher. And I walked in one day and she goes, I want all of you to write a poem about a flower. Right? So in my backyard, Maria, Solidago is the way you say it, sempervirens, which sounds really weird to me, but I'll go with your pronunciation. Seaside goldenrod, my backyard. Nice little place. I'm right there next to, you know, the nice little moraine. I got all sorts of glacial till back there, really sandy soil, and there's a lot of downed oak trees. So, nice little habitat for it. Ken raises his hand as a 7th grader and says, what flower? And she says, it doesn't matter. And Ken said, I decided I would never be in literature then. And I told him, you're absolutely right. You had the worst teacher possible. Why would you write a poem about a flower that you have no idea what it is? You have no idea why it's there. You have no idea of its ecology. You have no idea of its family. You have no relationship to it. And if you write that poem about that flower without that background, it's sentimentality. It's not thought. It's not good writing. It's not reflection. That's the one where that's the problem that's happened. And I would argue that I think that happens very often in the humanities, where we're talking today, and we're sometimes talking about how the sciences have siloed and you have all these expectations. But I would argue the same problem exists in the humanities. We publish to other people in English. No one reads literary criticism other than literary critics because it's horrible. It's really bad by people who supposedly can write. But it's not intended for a broad audience. It's not trying to engage people into reading. It's trying to speak to specialists. And when we engage in the question of environmental communication, that's what we have to reject. So let me show you this, and just show you a couple of ways that I think that people can begin to change the way that the place for poetry to participate in environmental communication. I think it begins in part in venue, which is, if you go to the New York Botanic Gardens now, certainly on the weekends, but while the Chihuly exhibit is here, right, you'll see these little placards, K through 12 poetry. It's reviewed and assessed and discussed by a relatively well-known poet from the Poetry Society of America, and in conjunction with the New York Botanic Gardens. They have these sitting right off the side. And as you're walking by, you'll see a short one by Sophia, I can't pronounce her last name, but that one. Beautiful sea urchin. Sea urchin, sea urchin. That spiny sea urchin. You're made out of glass. You live in the sea. You are as blue as the water. So stay with me. Kindergartner. But what's important is the way it takes poetry and it puts it outside of the book, outside of the coffee house, outside of the context that we had as the stereotype at the beginning. And it puts it next to the exhibit in a way in which when people are walking by, yes, it's a kindergartner's poem, but it makes you reflect in the engagement of that moment. And it uses art in a way, when it's applied, which I love the idea of applied arts, that's the way it can be. It changes the context of your moment. So another one, this is from the Poets House in New York and a zoo collaboration. What they did is they had a collaboration where they had 5 zoos, and they had the wildlife biologists from the zoos, the exhibit designers, and poets work together to think about how to bring poetry to people going through the exhibits and to reshape maybe some old lines of poetry that they're used to seeing. So this is Langston Hughes, a Harlem Renaissance writer from New York in the 1920s. The poem is, the title is The Negro Speaks of Rivers. But what they did is they put this on a piece of clear plastic that the viewer goes through and sees this across the wetlands, looking out into the river. And so they're recontextualizing Hughes's poetry in light of the thing that they're seeing behind it. And here, if you look, they're taking actually, I think this is actually one of Allison's poems, and they're writing it out on the curb of the walkway that goes through this, right in front of a little kind of forest area. So I want to say that that's the part to me where the curious place for poetry is this idea that there are other venues and there are other ways to engage poetry, traditional poetry, in ways that I do think help us to reimagine this notion of communication. So, Dr. Schubel, I'm kind of interested to talk with you about this. How in the heck did poetry end up in the biennial reports? And by the way, Heather McHugh, the daughter of, I think you say Laurie McHugh? Okay. A MacArthur winner, 8 books of poetry, considered one of the most important poets. By the way, if you get a chance, go back and look at her poem at the beginning of that biennial report. I don't know our element. I was reading the poetry last night. I know you know this whole history. And the one I'm going to have to really talk to you a lot about is the Taproot group and the poetry contest, where there are the 3 poems in the last one. And what's really nice is they're placed in between the other reports. And so you're shifting between outreach communication to a poem on the side here, to then back to some of the science, to funding, and then there's another poem. And that was really one where I was looking through that and I was going, that's a really nice way of doing it. And for readers, it's a way of kind of taking this other information and then allowing what are our creative selves to sort of drift in between those. And, let's see, Dr. Swanson, you have a young burgeoning poet amongst yourselves here. I'm working on his 2nd poem. He has his students in his oceanography class write a poem. But one of the nicest things that I'm seeing with Larry's work is how hard he's working at it. And it doesn't matter it's going to have a large audience. That's not the point of poetry. The poetry is to engage something. And quite honestly, it's really nice. And as I tell him, I'm honored to look over it, because that's what poets do. External to the idea that poetry is making sure I'm going to get it published in the New Yorker. That's fine. I'm sure there are people who can do that. It won't be me. It might be Larry. No, not me. So let me say this. The place for poetry is that it can find a relevant place in environmental communication. I don't think it's going to carry the power of multimedia like Heidi will talk about later. I don't think it's going to be the same kind of place, because I don't think that that's the way poetry, at least traditional poetry, works. But I think that what we've got to do as humanities people is to get out of our silos and to imagine that the skill sets that we have in rhetoric, art, communication, audience, and all the things that you've heard about before, that we use those to reimagine this use of language. To think about the fact that maybe poetry doesn't need to be the sort of preeminent form of communication here, but it might have a place. It might help us reimagine something that we otherwise would think very dully about, or even sentimentally. At its best, poetry can cut through these things, ignorance, and re-engage us in this sense of community, both human and non-human. So, I was showing this earlier, the picture on the front. There's at Penn State, they have a large environmental education center. It's about 1,800 acres. And they created what's called a long-term ecological reflection project. And they're bringing in writers and writers and visual artists, photographers, and then also naturalists. And they're creating a 100-year reflection project. And the idea is that over those 100 years, once they have enough data, they're actually then going to go back and look for trends of what they're seeing from the art. So the first book is coming out this spring. This is the one that'll conclude it, my little poem about the last part of it, which is just walking the trail all day. It's an 8-mile trail that I just walked about 15 times, as much as I could. It's just going and going. So, thank you very much. Yes?
I used to like poetry. A long time ago, I tried myself. But I saw that in poetry, the most important thing is rhyme.
Yes.
Everything should be rhymed. And otherwise, it's not poetry, in my opinion, because that's what makes it hard. Otherwise, anybody can just write poems.
Well, it's really interesting because, of course, with it, if I were to do the sort of, poet critique thing, there's literally 10 to 15 different forms of rhyme. There's slant rhyme, there's masculine rhyme, there's all sorts of forms of rhyme. There's internal rhyme, there's all sorts of things you can do with it. And poets who are very astute at their craft really play with that in very nuanced ways. I think, though, this is the part where if you're saying to me that poetry probably needs to sort of pay attention to its audience more and have a little bit more rhyme and a little bit more rhythm, I would say to you, yes, I think that's part of the problem. Just like there are different kinds of venues and audiences, I think when you're reaching out to different audiences, you're writing different kinds of poetry. When I'm trying to talk to a group at the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, I'm doing a very different kind of presentation than I did today. And in the same way, I would say that's true of poetry. Yes?
I'm enjoying this enormously. Can you give us another hour and talk about Hamilton as related to what you do?
I think Hamilton's a really great example of someone who knows how to reach a public about a topic that's relevant at the time in a venue and style that makes sense. And yeah, it's just rap. It's not even hip hop, it's just rap. Yeah. Yes?
Thanks a lot. That was fascinating. I just want to put in a vote for my pet art form for environmental communication. Poetry, of course, painting, etc., dance even. Mine, where I find the most powerful, personally, is opera, both classical and very recent, in the last 10 years. Just the combination of poetry, rhythm, music, lighting, gesture, movement, story, I find as powerful as movies. And so there's a lot of really great stuff that I would like to expose students to in both classical and contemporary opera, environmentally speaking.
Well, and I think that's, again, what I would argue is part of the problem, and back when I was attending operas a little more commonly, I remember feeling like I had to dress up. In Dallas, we weren't sure what opera was. We were looking for the cow. But I do think that this is part of the question that I would say what happened to opera is the musical. And that's exactly why opera seems sometimes a little more removed, elite, unconcerned about a general audience, which is not opera's tradition, right? Opera's tradition, it was the musical of 18th century, Italy, if you want to look at it that way. I think that's the one that I would say it is our responsibility as artists to begin to reimagine where we ply our art and to imagine differing audiences. And I think there are always audiences there for art that's engaging and art that's compassionate to its audience, whether it's opera or poetry. Yeah. So, thank you again.